On your screens is the saddest and ugliest Merkava tank model you've ever seen on YouTube. But in this video, from this ugly duckling, we are going to make this beauty. So, it's time to say hello. Hi, my name is Vlad and you are watching the Noquality Dioramas channel. Right now I'm working on this Merkava, that I bought a year ago from a well-known Chinese website. This model has a lot of problems and many mistakes, but I immediately liked the number of rivets, pins and other small details. They will give our model a big advantage during painting. But before we start painting, we need to properly refine the model itself. The first thing I started with was the tracks. The ones that came with the kit looked, well, let's just say, not great. So I spent some time in Blender, actually a whole week, and created my own tracks. I decided not to make the entire chassis. That would have taken a couple more weeks and require a lot of testing. And most importantly, on an FDM 3D printer I would have lost quality. Especially since the original wheels have tons of rivets and small details, which will work in our favor when painting. So I only made the tracks myself and kept everything else from the original model. The printing was done using PLA, which is a big plus. PLA softness when heated and can be shaped as needed. So I carefully bent the tracks and glued them in place. I won't bore you with the long process, I'll just show you the result. This is what one of the track section looks like now. In my opinion, it's way better than before. Yes, maybe the tracks don't exactly match the Merkava Mk.III version. I based them on Merkava Mk.IV, but I don't think it will be a big issue. While the tracks were drying, I moved on to the tank turret. Here I also wanted to add a few details. I had this jerry can, I printed it a couple of years ago on a resin 3D printer, and to me it fits perfectly on modern vehicle like the Merkava. But just gluing it on would be too simple. I decided to make a special mounting frame for it. I made the frame from thin plastic rod that I bought on the same Chinese site. It's a very handy material, you can use it to make antennas, railing, handrails and ton of other small useful parts for models and dioramas. This is the frame I made, and it looks pretty decent. That means it's time to move on to other detail. The first was the Browning 50 calibers machine gun, mounted on the front of the turret. I created model in Blender and printed it on my FDM 3D printer. Of course you can see some printing defects and layer lines, but I think compared to the kit parts, mine looks much better. On the same printer I printed ammo boxes that I also made in Blender. I didn't bother with the tank's full armament system, just the boxes. I think that's enough to visually enrich the model. The next replacement were parts that I hope are correctly called rocket launchers. Or maybe they are smoke grenade launchers. I also printed this on my FDM printer and installed them on the turret. Compared to the original parts, mine look neater. Although I admit I should have added rivets, brackets and other small details, but the idea of how to do that came only after model was already assembled. While the turret was drying, I want to show you my first personally created figures. Yes, printing figures in 1/72 scale on an FDM 3D printer it's not an easy task. There are plenty of visible layer lines, but I deliberately made them without very fine details, so that the imperfection could be hidden during painting. Now that the track have dried, I assembled them along with the tank itself. Even at this stage it looks more interesting than at the beginning. But this is not the final result, the work continues. The rear part in the base model was completely empty, not a single detail. So I made and added two simple parts, reassembling the stoplight. Simple, but still much better than before. I also made models of this kind of boxes. There are compartments mounted on the rear of the Merkava. Usually they carry jerry cans and other necessary crew equipment. I also modeled the FN Mk machine gun. To be honest, the print didn't come out very well, so I took the barrel from the original model. It looks much better, I think. Unfortunately, my FDM printer struggles with such a small scale, but I managed to keep some details. Here is how the machine gun looks on the turret. But I still needed to add an ammo box. But during assembly it turned out that it didn't fit properly on the left side as it should. So I placed it on the right. Not entirely correct, of course, but there is no other option. Off camera I also glued the turret hatches from the kit. They look quite decent and don't spoil the model. By the way, during printing I noticed that the printer sometimes produces very thin plastic wire. It's perfect for simulating barbed wire or cables. I decided to use it as a cable connecting the 50 caliber machine gun to the equipment inside the turret, and it turned out quite convincing. Next I worked on filling the equipment basket on the rear of the turret. I placed a jerry can and several ammo boxes in it. I didn't get too detailed, my goal was simply to cover the hole, because the basket should have holes that I didn't model. I just needed to mask them. Additionally, I made a couple of rolled up tarps. I also printed them on the FDM printer and added them to the model. They look quite decent and definitely don't spoil the composition. Of course, the result will be better with a resin printer, but as I said before, I don't have a resin printer yet. And the FDM printer generally hands 1/72 scale, albeit not perfectly. When all these parts were in place, it was time to work on the antennas. I made them from the same plastic rod I used to mount the jerry can on the turret. I just drilled a couple of holes, inserted the antennas, and that's it. Take a look at the final result. For you it's just a few minutes, but for me it was several days of work. The simple model already looks much better, interesting and detailed. Now we can move forward. First I decided to leave the front hatch open. The upcoming diorama with this tank assumes that the crew will be outside of the vehicle, so the hatch should be open. While the hatch and turret were drying, I worked on additional details, including the two baskets I mentioned earlier. I am going to attach them to the rear of the tank. I didn't want to cover them with tarps or fill them completely. Their shape and emptiness add an interesting visual effect. So I'll leave one of them empty. It looks quite decent in my opinion, it only added more interest to the model. I decided to pull a small tarp in the right basket. It was left over after printing, and since I had the chance to use it, why not? After that, I get back to the turret, and on the left side, which was quite empty, I added a piece of track. It's the first printed version of the track, and not very successful, but as an additional details, it fits pretty well. I also wanted to install these small parts. Honestly, I don't know their exact name. They run along the entire rear part of the turret. They turned out okay, but due to the scale, they are too fragile. I think they will simply break off during painting, so I decided not to risk it. By the way, all the parts I used for assembling this model are included in a special kit. It will be available either through my Patreon subscriptions or on the Noquality website. There you will be able to download the whole pack, absolutely everything I used for this model, and you can use it on your own project. But let's get back to the model. I still tried to glue these small parts, visually they complement the model, but I repeat, for FDM printing they are too fragile, and I didn't use them in the final version. However, these bottles fit perfectly. They are also from my set, which will be available via the link in the description or on my Noquality page. This is a pack of modern plastic bottles, in this case 5-liter ones. I decided to place them on the right side of the turret. I think it's a logical addition. Judging by the conditions in which this tank operates, it's quite hot here. Like James Brown said, it's hot! So water will definitely be useful. Maybe it's not drinking water but technical water, but even so, it adds life and detail to the model. Well, the turret is almost finished. Only one detail remains, the tow cable. I also modeled tow cables myself, and they are included in the kit as I mentioned earlier. For the cable itself, I used leftover plastic rod scraps from the 3D printing. I decided to wrap it around the turret so it would look natural and integrated. So far, I haven't decided whether to paint the cable in a separate color or keeping the same as a whole. I would appreciate it if you share your opinion in the comments. There is still time before I place this model onto diorama, so it will be great to hear your opinion. And so that probably brings the first part of the video to a close. From a simple and frankly sad looking Merkava, we now have a model that looks much more interesting and can certainly be considered a quality build on the Noquality Dioramas channel. Yes, of course, I could have just bought a ready-made kit, higher quality, more accurate and of course expensive. But look at it differently. I am someone who loves challenges. I enjoy finding what's broken or poorly made and turning it into something worthy. It's not only interesting but also truly rewarding, and that's exactly what our hobby offers. Why not take advantage of that, right? But enough talk, it's time to get to work. That means painting begins. The first step as always is priming, and after that the model already looked significantly better. It now reads as a whole, not just a collection of separate parts. Then came perhaps one of the most difficult moments in all my modeling experience – choosing the color. I spent a long time thinking about which shade to choose for this Merkava. There were options ranging from olive drab, darker tones and even sandy colors. In the end I decided on something in between. I mixed paint from ATM and Vallejo. It was golden yellow from Vallejo, beige flesh from Vallejo, and yellow and a bit of camouflage green from ACM. And this is the color I got. Yes, some might say this shade suits an Abrams better, but I think Abrams should have a more saturated yellow, without green. So my color is definitely closer to Merkava, especially considering the further weathering and effects. And I want to warn you right away, don't be alarmed. After all the effects, the final color of the tank will change noticeably. I'll start with a coat of matte varnish. Unfortunately, I don't have a special modeling varnish yet, so I'm using an artist varnish. It works quite well. Also, sometimes it leaves a whitish residue, but that's not a problem, it's easy to remove in the next stage. After the first varnish coat, I was going to apply decals. But since I don't have a special decal setting solution, and because the model surface is covered with pins and rivets, I realized that the decals would not settle well, so I decided to paint some of the decals by hand. For that I used Vallejo Dictan color. It works great and perfectly imitates the original decals from the kit. I decided to finally apply the small decals on the rear part of the tank. Then I applied a second coat of varnish and moved it onto the wash. This time I gave Amos enamel wash another chance. It didn't meet my expectation the last time, but I hoped it would work better now. After spending just a few hours, I got this result. At this stage, honestly, it looked pretty rough, but that's how it's supposed to be. Enamel wash is easy to remove and lets you create very neat shading. Yes, it took quite some time, but it was worth it. Unfortunately, during the transfer of the video files to my computer, the power went off. And most of the process was lost, so I can't show the work on the whole, but I'll show how I applied the wash on the turret. I applied the wash differently depending on the relief. For example, in the recesses the best method was to apply it fully, then carefully remove the excess with a brush. This leaves shading where it needs, while cleaning other areas. Of course, I still need to practice wash technique and understand the process better. Of course, you may spot many mistakes, I understand that and will try to fix them. But before fixing all the small things, I decided to switch gear a bit. The wash application disappointed me slightly, so I wanted to take a break from that stage and look at the model from a different perspective. Mixing the base color with some Dectan from Vallejo, I started highlighting light areas. Small bolts, rivets, raised ribs and other tiny details on the model. This technique, as I've mentioned many times before, works great. It adds volume and makes the model much more interesting. It's worth noting this is rather painstaking and even meditative process. So for such delicate work, it's best to put on a movie, audiobook or music and just enjoy the process. You may think it's not to rush, because haste leads to mistakes. That's exactly what happened to me. When I was applying the light paint to the side of the hole, there were many rivets and I forgot to turn on music or something in the background. I rushed and made mistakes. Luckily, it didn't ruin the model. Look how the model transformed after this technique. It looks very lively and interesting. Now I can move on to the next step, painting individual parts in their appropriate colors. I decided to pair fire extinguishers on both sides of the turret in a light rust color. It's not too contrasting and fits well within the overall color theme. If I had chosen bright red or deep red, the parts will stand out too much and spoil the look. I used the same color for the jerry can on the left side of the turret and for the rear light. On the original Merkava, the rear lights look a bit different, but my printer couldn't produce such a fine detail. I tried printing it 4 times without success, so I kept the model simpler. After this small part dried, I applied a wash to them to bring a bit more life to their appearance. Then I moved on to painting the machine guns black. There isn't much work here, just painting, and before adding the model to the diorama, I might slightly shade them with a grey pencil to imitate metallic shine. I also added a small detail on the top of the 50 caliber machine gun. It's not entirely accurate or historically correct, but in my opinion it looks better than without it. Next, I started painting the tarps located on the rear of the tank's turret. One of my previous videos received a great comment: don't paint large detail too bright, so they don't stand out too much on the model. That's really good advice. So I painted the tarps in the color close to the tank's base color. This way they stay within the army palette but don't draw too much attention. Thank you, kind person, for this comment. The second tarp I painted with ACM Middlestone color. This shade fits perfectly into the overall palette and is slightly different from the tank's base color, which again improves the model. Since the bottles are quite small, they can be painted in a different color. I choose a shade close to that of ordinary plastic containers. Sometimes they are transparent, sometimes with a slight bluish tint. I made them fairly bright, so they can be shaded later with a wash. The tarp in one of the rear baskets is placed at low and doesn't catch much attention, so I made it a bit more sandy in color. This adds some variety to the model's color theme and subtly highlights the detail without blending into the background. Off camera, I painted the straps on the tarps and added some highlights. Then I began applying washes to individual details on the rear part of the tank. While the power was out, I also painted the tank's tracks, just touching up with black and fixing some minor painting mistakes. I won't dwell on that since it's straightforward. After fixing the errors, I applied a lighter color to rivets, pins and other small details on the tracks to make them stand out. Next, I decided to add some details to the tank's main gun. I've seen photos of Merkava with white strips on the gun barrel. This detail is important because it gives some character to the model and it looks just cool. Although it's a small detail, it has a big impact on the overall look. Now it's time to move on to oil washes. I use them to create various dirt effects and other scenes of VR that makes the model look more lively and realistic. With simple strokes like this, I apply the oil-based wash. Of course, use it Van Dyke Brown. Then gently blend it with a thinner. This results in a subtle dirt effect that perfectly complements the model and adds realism. I also refreshed the previous wash since it had dulled a bit after drying. The oil paints help bring back the shadow's richness and freshness. Then I used other shades of oil paint, light ochre and burnt umber. They also add character to the model by creating dirt and rust effect in some areas. This emphasizes that the vehicle is already in use and far from new. If you are watched so far, you are probably noticed the model has completely transformed. Unfortunately, I make a lot of work off camera, because the power went out again and I didn't want to wait since it could take a long time to come back on. But briefly, what I did was apply a lot of oil paint to create various dirt effect. Then carefully remove the excess, leaving only what's really needed. The process is simple, but requires time and patience. After spending the needed time, I got this result, and honestly, I am very happy with it. If you remember how this Merkava looked before all this effect and compare it to now, it's night and day. And now it's time for the final touch. On both sides of the tank I added some oil paint splatter. I like this technique from how it looks on the KV tank in one of my previous videos, so I decided to use it here as well. And as you can see, it turned out quite interesting. The model doesn't look too dirty or worn out, but the effect is noticeable and fitting for this tank. Also off camera I painted all the optical devices. I used to often forget about this, but after looking through many photos of Merkava, I noticed the optics have a slightly bluish tint with a purple shimmer. I thought that was a cool touch and added the same color. And here is the final result of my work, and honestly I am really happy with it. When I bought this model, I honestly didn't have much faith in success. It seemed like nothing particularly good would come out of them. But now I feel it's time to start a series when I turn toys into fully fledged models. The result is already more than decent. I hope you share my opinion. If you do, please be sure to leave a comment, give this video a thumb up, and if not, don't hesitate to share your thoughts and explain why you think that way. I'm really interested to hear your opinion and get your advice. Well, that's all for today. The video has come to an end. In the next video we will make a cool diorama for this Merkava and paint the figures I've already shown you. Also, I only show one so far. Trust me, there will be 2 figures in the diorama and they will look amazing, perfectly complementing the model. So that's it for now. As always, you'll find all the useful links to extra models, to my Patreon or Noquality page in video description. This was Vlad from the Noquality Dioramas channel. Take care of yourself, look after your health and that of your loved ones. Don't forget to tell them how much they mean to you, and of course show it with your action. Thanks to everyone, see you soon. Beep beep boop boop.